Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Lewin, the CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe. It's been a long year and we're into a new one. While our doors in Mountain View are closed, our digital doors are wide open. And I'm pleased to welcome you here today to our virtual event on personal genetic testing, how it works and its potential to affect how we think of ourselves and others as humans in ways that are both deeply personal and powerful for society at large. This public program is a part of our ongoing focus on innovation that delivers on the museum's core mission, which is to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, the digital present, and its future impact on humanity. I'm delighted to introduce Chris Schmidt, the executive producer of NOVA and our partner in today's program. Chris?
Thank you so much, Daniel. On behalf of my co-executive producer, Julia Court, and GBH Boston, I would just like to say we are so excited to be partnering with the Computer History Museum again. The last time we did this was in October 2019, which was 175 years ago, I think, pretty much. And if I remember correctly, that time we presented a film called Look Who's Driving. It was a deep dive into the art of autonomous vehicles. We had a great night of discussion about the human implications of a transformative technology powered by computing. But what really made an impression on us that night was the size and enthusiasm of the audience. So of course we wanted to do it again. And as much as I wish we could all be together in that beautiful auditorium, being able to share this evening virtually with so many people in so many locations definitely feels like a silver lining. Not to mention that there's no dress code. Look Who's Driving was produced by Kikim Media, a company founded by Michael Schwartz and Kiki Kapani in Menlo Park, right next door to you guys. Their film was so impactful that pretty much as soon as it was finished, we got the band right back together and set out to make another film, tonight's deep dive into another transformative technology, this direct consumer DNA testing thing, which, by the way, would definitely not be a thing if not for computing. You know, it's no accident that the evolution of our understanding of DNA and the human genome has tracked very closely to the evolution of the digital age that we live in. Computation, networking, machine learning, it's all part of the story. And that's why tonight, once again, presents an amazing opportunity for NOVA and CHM to team up again. This time, to explore the intersection between something deeply human, the yearning for identity, and a deeply human invention, the computer. And by the way, it's worth pointing out that DNA is not so different from a computer. Both store information, both execute instructions, although I think the more we learn about DNA, the more we're realizing that nature may still be way ahead of us when it comes to digital technology. All right, this is just like a nerd alert. Computers count by 2s, DNA counts by 4s. So just something to think about. Anyway, before I hand over the rest of the show to the stars of this evening, I'd just like to quickly thank John Berdar, our Vice President for Programming at GBH in Boston, our President and CEO, John Abbott, and our champion at PBS, Bill Gardner. Julia and I and our staff are so appreciative of their unrelenting support. And thank you to the incredible panelists tonight, to our own Gina Varamo, Master Cat Herder, and thank you to our sister station, KQED, for all that you do to advance science literacy and promote NOVA as we work together to make the wonder of science and rational thought accessible to everyone. Finally, I want to dedicate this evening to our good friend, Michael Schwartz, whose sad and untimely passing a little over a year ago came as a terrible blow to all of us. And especially thank you to his wife, Kiki Kapani, and collaborator, Ed Gray, for carrying on and finishing the work you and Michael began. We really miss you, Michael. Thank you so much. Over to you, Marguerite.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's such a Pleasure to partner with you, as you said again, and also with Kiki Kapani and Kiko Media. As we think about today's topic, as you've started, we're thinking about the 30 million people who have sent their DNA to be analyzed, and what are some of the questions that people are having as we try to decode what's happening here? How does the science and technology of personal genetic testing work? And what are some of the underlying economic and business drivers? What are potential implications, such as for our privacy, our relationships, or issues that are timely and important, like social justice? What is the promise and peril of personal DNA, and can we trust it? To explore the power and limits of this topic, we're just thrilled to have the opportunity tonight to showcase clips from the new Nova film, Secrets in Our DNA, and also a discussion among a distinguished panel of 4 experts who bring unique expertise in the science, the business, the law, and social impact related to this topic. It's been a pleasure to talk with each of them in preparation for today's events. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As is tradition, I'll introduce each person with 5 numbers. First, Robert Greene, Professor of Medicine and Genetics at Harvard Medical School and Director of the Genomes to People Research Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital. 32 years of continuous NIH funding culminating in the MedSec and BabySec genomic screening projects. 56 genes recommended in 2013 for screening, the first official medical policy of the preventive genomics era. 5,922 genes screened in 2020 through the Brigham and Preventive Genomics Clinic, the first academic clinic to provide these services to families. 1 company co-founded, Genome Medical, and 5 Grammys as a member of Robert Shaw's Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Chorus. Welcome, Robert. Next, Jacquie Haggarty, Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Privacy Officer at 23andMe. 15 is the number of years practicing as a lawyer. 3, the number of academic degrees, a BA, MPP, JD, and also the number of daughters, 3. 11 million, the number of 23andMe customers she works for. 0, the number of times 23andMe has produced user information to law enforcement without customer consent. 324, the number of seconds in her fastest mile in 2020. And if my math is right, that's under 5.5 minutes. Fatimah Jackson, Professor of Biology and Director of Cobb Research Laboratory at Howard University. 40 years teaching as a university professor, 29 peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and other scientific publications. 49 years married to her husband, 6 adult children, and 9 grandchildren. Welcome, Fatimah. Erin Murphy, Professor of Law at NYU and expert in forensic DNA typing. 18 years since she viewed her first forensic DNA file. 5 years practicing law as a public defender. 4 times her work has been cited by the US Supreme Court. 3 schools that she's taught at, and 7 continents that she's set foot on. So glad to have you here as well, Erin. And last but certainly not least, our moderator for today, Dr. Talithia Williams. To lead this conversation, I'm so glad to welcome you back to the CHM stage, Talithia. She's an associate professor of mathematics and associate dean at Harvey Mudd College. She earned degrees in mathematics from Spelman College and Howard University, and her PhD in statistics from Rice University. Professional experiences range from research appointments at NASA and the National Security Agency to collaboration with the World Health Organization. She is co-host of the PBS series Nova Wonders, and she's delivered speeches around the country on the value of statistics and quantifying personal health information. Welcome, Robert, Jacquie, Fatimah, Erin, and Talithia. Thanks to each of you, and over to you, Talithia, to kick off our conversation.
Marguerite, thank you so much. I'm so excited to welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion of the new Nova film, Secrets in Our DNA. I especially want to thank the film's producer, Kiki Kapani, and her late visionary husband, Michael Schwartz, whose vision it was to kind of take us behind the curtain of consumer DNA testing and really shed a light for us on the entire industry and the people, our friends and family who are impacted by it. So this film highlights how consumer DNA testing has really kind of reimagined how we think about everything from ancestry and genealogy to disease risk and even our health. And our panelists this evening are going to share with you some of the promises and also some of the perils of consumer DNA test and how this new technology is really impacting society and kind of changing our life. We've got 4 clips that we want to share with you tonight with a discussion from our panelists following each clip. So without delay, why don't we jump into our first clip? So in this clip, we see these 2 long lost half sisters. They find each other through their DNA results. And in fact, throughout the film, we see stories of people discovering lost siblings or learning that they were adopted through these tests. Panelists, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what role can DTC, direct to consumer testing, play in helping us understand our roots and our history, and how does it actually impact connections among people?
I'd love to start on that, and thank you for having me. So, I mean, you just watch a clip like that and you just get chills. The stories are just so powerful. And we hear from our customers every day about how through learning about their DNA, they're writing and starting these new chapters in their lives. So DNA, of course, can play such an important role in shaping your family history and your identity, in telling you where your DNA comes from around the world. And it's one of many data points, that ultimately informs your identity. On family connections specifically, I just note that first, whether or not you use your DNA to find new genetic relatives with 23andMe is a separate choice you make when you're a customer, and that's something you'll hear me talk about a lot. Today is choice, because we understand that some people want to find new relatives. They're interested in seeing what their DNA can show them about new relatives they may have, and others may not be interested. Finding new relatives or learning about an unexpected relationship no doubt impacts family connections. For some, this may open a new chapter and discovery into one's family history. And for others, it may universally be relieving and perhaps bring closures to questions that they've had their whole life.
Right. Thanks, Jacquie. Other thoughts on sort of what it means to, through your DNA test, discover connections to other people?
I think that this is very profound, just as Jacquie mentioned. It does make you recognize the connections, often hidden, that we maintain with the rest of humanity. Mm-hmm. I think that this kind of testing, because it's so powerful, it can begin to heal some of the psychic wounds of slavery and the distortions and the loss of ancestry that were part of that cruel system. And I've actually seen that with some of the populations that I'm working with, and they're able to connect to specific people, specific families in Africa, and they're in the United States. Mm. And it has, when they make the physical connection or the visual connection on Zoom, then they are able to connect the 400 years of separation.
Yes.
And when on these occasions, what I've seen is that the Africans are able to give information that the African Americans want. Mm. And the African Americans are able to say what happened to those long lost Africans who were enslaved generations back, because of course we have some documentation, but it doesn't tell us the name of that first African. And that's what the Africans can provide. So the bridge, it's as if 400 years of conscious oppression has been obviated by the genetic testing results. So it's quite powerful.
Yes. So of our panelists, of the 4 of you, raise your hand if you've ever taken any kind of DNA test. Oh, okay. Very nice. Oh, I did see your hand up, Erin, yes?
Well, I just wanted to be, I think I'm the resident skeptic on the panel. So I thought I should weigh in, because I think it's very important. You know, it's very hard not to hear these stories and find them moving. And certainly, particularly when you talk about trying to unwind the legacies of the horrors of slavery or kidnapping in some other country, you know, things that really felt lost to history that now we can reclaim. It's hard not to get exuberant about that. But I think it's important to put you know, something on the other side of the scale, because DNA is a tool just like any other tool, and humans use tools for good, but they also use tools for evil. And I think you see that in history. And I will just say, you know, even in the story we just heard, you hear things like, you know, I want to find out who I really am. This gives me, you know, when she finds her, it gives me a sense of belonging. Hey, we have the same blood. And I think it's beautiful to imagine a world in which information like that is used to connect us. But history teaches information like that is often used to divide us and actually to further oppression, not to unwind oppression. And I think you also see that, you know, there's another story in this documentary about using DNA to sort of find a relative who committed a horrible and vicious crime. And it's always striking to me that when you're finding your half sister or you're finding your cousin, you know, it's, I know who I am and they get me. And this is the essence, something about the biology. We share the same blood. We're the same people. I know who I am now. You never hear the people whose blood points to a murderer who's done a vicious crime or a rapist who's done terrible things say, I know who I am now. You know, the blood has told me the truth of my identity. At best, you'll hear them say, you know, I'm so glad I could solve the crime, but they're not going to claim that biological connection the way someone, you know, who's looking to make that attachment is going to claim it. And I think we have to be careful not to fetishize biology, not to romanticize biology. The history of the eugenics movement, Nazi, you know, the history of the Nazis, the history of slavery in and of itself, the Uyghurs now in China. We have a long history in the human race of biologizing to separate, oppress, harm. And we can't ignore that in favor of a kind of selective vision of when it can bring us together as well.
You make such a great point, because sometimes in, you know, getting the results from your test, it invokes this trauma, right, of sort of the connection to your blood and your DNA, which makes me wonder then, why do you think it's gaining in popularity? What kind of draws people into the testing in spite of, you know, the issues that you brought up, Erin? Anybody can answer that.
I was gonna say, I don't know if that's
Why did you all take a test of the three who did? What made you take a test?
I'll jump in there. I mean, I personally took the test because I was interested, and I tested with 23andMe because I was interested in seeing what my DNA said about both my health and about my ancestral origins. Yeah. In terms of, you know, the increasing popularity or why more people are drawn to DNA testing now, I think people are really interested in, and they're increasingly familiar with what you can learn from your DNA. So more and more people now are going to know someone who's tested as that number grows and have that as an additional reference point about the power of what you can learn. You know, I think people also are really appreciating what their DNA can say about their health, and the empowerment that a customer and that an individual and as a patient can have in having this information and really being an advocate for themselves with respect to their health in a system, in a healthcare system that is not directed right now at prevention.
Yeah. And before we go to clip 2, Robert, I want to hear your thoughts about how sort of the business of consumer testing works. Can you talk about what some of the economic drivers and incentives are for companies that are in this field?
Yeah, so I'm a medical geneticist, and I really look at these things through the prism of healthcare and health. But the killer app in genomics has been Ancestry. That's what's really pulled people into this. That's what they've really wanted to buy. People are endlessly curious about their past and their relatives and all the themes you've been talking about. And I think it's so fascinating that some of the companies also offered health insights. And that's really allowed this incredible interest in Ancestry to open the door for people to learn more about the health aspects of their DNA as well, as Jacquie alluded to. Now, why is that important? Because genetics was this tiny little club of clinicians around rare diseases for many, many years, and perhaps would have stayed that way for much longer had it not been for these companies that truly exploded that orthodoxy and allowed people to start learning something about their health at the same time that they were learning about their ancestry.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, panelists, why don't we move into clip number 2? The study group at Westchester clearly had very varied results based on their ethnicities. And so Jacquie and Fatimah, I'm curious, why do direct-to-consumer testing companies have less data on people of African and Asian descent? And then also, how should these companies start to address this lack of data?
So I'll take a first stab at that. So I mean, that issue and the lack of representation of, of African Asian populations, I think is a reflection of history and the mistreatment of individuals historically in medical research. So whether it's stories like Henrietta Lacks or Tuskegee syphilis trial, there are numerous historical events for us to overcome in order to bring true equality and get communities of color willing to participate in the same way that European populations traditionally have. At 23andMe, we've over the years done and continue to do a number of initiatives in order to diversify our database. So we have an African American sequencing project, a global genetics project, and we work with academic institutions, including Yale and the University of Leicester, to study and really grow our database so that underrepresented populations grow in numbers in our database.
Great, yes. Fatimah, you were featured in that clip. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that what has happened is we've approached genetic testing with a lack of an evolutionary perspective. If, wherever a species originates, you tend to find the greatest genomic diversity. And that diversity would be for Homo sapiens in Africa, because it's our continental homeland. There's been more time spent on that continent, more time to accumulate mutations and so forth. And yet Africa has been the last place, one of the last places that comprehensive genetic testing has been done. So I think that the situation in Africa, the continent of Africa, is a little more complex than outside of Africa because of the diversity of ecological zones and the often unknown history or poorly known history of the indigenous population. So we're really trying to change that. At Howard University, we've been trying to develop alternative models, improved models for testing African populations and recognizing the magnitude of diversity within Africa, because it's not a one size fits all. You just can't randomly select a couple of people and capture the diversity that's on the continent. Right. So we're looking at model-based sampling as opposed to randomized sampling, and with the hope that if we can get a good handle on continental African diversity, then we can better understand the diversity in the diaspora. So we see these populations as linked because of the historical connection, but also because the genetics, Africans of the diaspora represent an amalgamation of African peoples. So that makes the genetic testing of Africans in the Americas even more complex than isolated regions on the continent of Africa. So some thought needs to go into it, and we're hoping that these models will be picked up by some of the geneticists with the technology and the computational power to actually test them out in the field. You know, Africa is it's essential that we know Africa if we're going to know Homo sapiens.
Right. Yes. So that brings me to the question then, Erin, I'm curious to hear what you think is the relationship then between sort of these social categories of race and ethnicity that we talk about, but then also the biological categories that are based on our ancestral patterns and some of the risk and benefits of underscoring these biological conceptions of these social categories.
I think that's a great question. Ultimately, race is a social category, and the same is true. And we see that, I think, whenever we really look carefully at race and ethnicity, we start to drill into how constructed it is, whether it's constructed in our language or constructed in our sense of identity. I always like to point out that Barack Obama is our first Black president. Everyone says it with pride, and yet he's a biracial man who was raised by a white woman primarily. And so there's a way in which there's sort of a one-drop rule, the historical rule of race in legal texts about what makes you a certain race or not, still in work in our culture. Or I have a friend who's a biologist in Spain who has a son who lives in Mexico, and he's a European, his son is Hispanic. There's this whole linguistic category that doesn't have anything to do with ancestral relations. And so something that everyone sort of thinks they know it when they see it, or it's very clear, becomes more complicated. And from a legal perspective, I think it's very important to remember that these social categories have profound legal significance. And they are of profound legal significance, whether it's who gets targeted by police, or whether it's who can avail themselves of policies intended to remedy historical injustices. There was a case of someone whose DNA test came back 4% African American, who said, 4% African descent, who said, well, I'm a minority business owner now, even though visually, socially, culturally, the person was white identified. We see this with, prominent senators like Elizabeth Warren, whose sort of family lore and identity, I guess people have different views of how earnest this was, but, said, like many people who I think are from areas where there's a still strong presence of Native Americans, our family, there's a little Native American, and the Native American tribe said, that doesn't make you Native American. I mean, even if you could claim some fraction of that, that's not what makes someone a Native American. So I think we are still figuring out cultural identity, cultural appropriation, opportunistic identity, and some of these biological ideas are really subtle. As Fatimah points out, apart from the lack of sophistication in the science still, that we don't really have as much of the science as we need, even with a sophisticated science, it's hard to explain to someone when you say, well, ancestrally, this is you. But what you call, France didn't look like France 500 years ago,
right.
Or who you think's living there now is not exactly how it all went down. And so there's been huge border changes, huge conquerings. Our history in the American race, or not American race, the human race, is one, I think, of kind of continued assimilation and migration and so forth. And that's easy to lose in a kind of 20% this type of answer.
Mm-hmm. So Robert, do you think that this perpetuates sort of a Eurocentrism in science and genetics?
Well, it does if we don't address it. And that is sort of one of the dangers of all this progress we're making in genomic health, is that we'll actually worsen disparities in health. Yeah. What my friend Jacquie Cunningham, who was in that clip, calls genomic apartheid. And so we have to consciously rebut that in our research, in our medical care, at every level that we function. Now, I will say that NIH has been focused on this for a long time and has done a remarkable job of emphasizing diversity and recruitment across the board. And most recently in the 1 million person All of Us study, which is up to 40 to 50% people who are underrepresented in biomedical research, diversity on many, many different axes. And that's absolutely critical for building the database of the future. But as it stands now, there's so much more genomic information that's been gathered and cataloged on folks of European background than of other diversities that there is a real threat to the benefits not accruing across the board.
So last question, panelists, before we go to our next clip, what do you think is the potential impact, either positive or negative, that this testing can play in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts?
I'll keep rolling just by saying that I think it's showing people that they are mixed, and that's good for humanity to see that we are, you know, in many ways alike, and in many ways we are mixed. It's revealing to people things that have real medical importance that they didn't know. If you don't know that you have Ashkenazi background, you don't know that you're much more likely to have a high frequency of certain types of mutations, and your children be at risk for certain types of birth defects. And all of those things are revealed to some degree through your genomics.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
It's changing our paradigms in science. I mean, I can see that not only in the lay community, but also in the scientific community, we've had to adjust our thinking and be more sophisticated in characterizing diversity. You know, diversity in the past just meant Black or white. And we're really realizing there's a lot more variability, and we have to be more subtle. And so that this bad idea of race, which has stagnated in the American population in particular, is being challenged, or will be challenged increasingly, by more genetic research, because the more you dig, the more you find out the absurdity of race as a concept, as a biological concept, and the importance of other variables, even beyond the gene, if we start looking at the epigenome and so forth, as influencing the actual phenotypes of people. And the phenotypes are the objects of selection. So it's changing the way that we look at science, and that has been for the better. You know, the technology is extremely powerful.
Thanks, Fatimah. All right, let's go to our third.
Can I add two more quick points?
Go right ahead,
You know,
yes.
one interesting thing from the law enforcement perspective that I think would be you know, good to add is that the use of these databases, because they so heavily tilt toward European descent, has actually enabled law enforcement to identify people who were otherwise not in law enforcement's databases or law enforcement's purview, which is to say our law enforcement structure heavily targets communities of color, is disproportionately wielded against Black people in our country. And so the databases through law enforcement reflect that disparity and that dramatic difference. And so tapping into these databases has actually had the kind of opposite effect. And people often point to that in an interesting way. I also wanted to add that the All of Us initiative that was mentioned earlier has within it a particular clause that says, you know, that kind of, we know that these are communities that have a distrust for good reason of government, of health, and so forth. And so we are not allowing law enforcement to have access to this medical information. And if you study the privacy laws such that they exist in the United States, that's unusual. In every privacy law, there's a law enforcement exemption, pretty much bar none. And this is one where they said no law enforcement exemptions because we need to collect this information for the reasons that were given. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, you know, as everyone knows, it was just MLK Day, and in our family, we have a tradition where we listen to one of Dr. King's speeches every day on the day, or read one if it's not recorded. And, you know, we were listening to the I Have a Dream speech, and it struck me in the speech for the first time, you know, he says, I wrote it down because it was so, it struck me. He said, you know, he says, I have a dream, everyone knows these words, that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, right? That's part of the dream. And getting ready for this panel, I was thinking about that. And I was thinking, you know, where does this kind of testing bring us? Does it bring us to an awareness of, you know, wow, I'm descended from this slave owner and I need to take responsibility for what that means in my kind of family line? You know, does it bring us to a place where you say, wow, no, I understand my history where I'm descended from slaves that were brought here? Or, and does that bring us to sit down at the table of brotherhood? Or is that a further kind of entrenchment of identity? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think it's an earnest question, but part of racial reconciliation that confronts history, as someone else said, it's going to be uncomfortable for people. Yes. And it's going to be something that the genetics has to be at best part of, but not an answer to, in my estimation.
Yes, Erin, thank you so much.
Follow up on some of the points Erin made, which I think were excellent. You know, it is really interesting how these databases and access by law enforcement has provided access to traditionally more European genetic data than law enforcement may have historically had access to. I would note that those law enforcement access is not to private databases such as 23andMe. There are two databases that are otherwise publicly available. But the other really important point that I think Erin made was around the role that policymakers have to play in this debate around law enforcement access, and you know, the point around how All of Us initiative, the explicit prohibition on law enforcement being able to access that data to enable you know, security and confidence in individuals participating in those databases and those programs, that their data will not somehow be used against them.
Yeah. Thanks, Jacquie. Any other comments before we go to clip 3? Great. All right. Cue us up. So let's talk a bit, and I know our audience wants to hear this too, about the science behind the test. Robert, I'm curious to hear, how exactly do direct-to-consumer DNA tests work, and how accurate are the results?
Well, this last clip was just another example of how Kiki Ed and Michael just did such a beautiful job of explaining really complicated ideas. And the one thing that's explained elsewhere in the piece that I would make sure the audience knows, if they remember nothing else from me at least, is the difference between array-based testing or SNP testing, which is what you can get from Ancestry and 23andMe and most of the consumer-facing companies in the range of $50 to $200, and sequencing, in which you get for a little higher price, and you get in usually a medical context. And the SNP-based testing is markers along the genome, different markers that you've pre-selected to interrogate. And it's great as far as it goes. But sequencing looks at every letter of your DNA in a particular gene. And so it can pick up really rare changes, and it can pick up changes that are unique to your family. So from a medical point of view, the sequencing is much, much better. Now, this controversy arose because it's sort of a question of half glass full and half glass empty. If you pick up these 3 common BRCA mutations, and you tell some women that they are carrying this, or some men, they're also at risk for cancer, that they're carrying these mutations, you've done them an enormous service, because they had no idea they were carrying this. But many people in my line of work worry that there will be some sort of false reassurance, that people don't really understand what they're getting. They think they've been comprehensively tested. And of course, there are at least 1,000 other BRCA mutations that won't be picked up. So a lot of people use this to bash the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. I'm not a basher. I think it's really important for the public to understand what they're getting and what they're not getting. They have to assume an additional degree of sophistication and responsibility when they step out of the conventional medical care system and decide to empower themselves by getting information directly. And I think that's their responsibility. I think the companies, especially the good ones, have done a really good job of putting the information up there, but you do have to read it and think about it. You can't make all sorts of assertions and assumptions about determinism and pseudo precision in a direct-to-consumer context.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I'd follow on that. So for 23andMe, you know, for customers that choose to view this report, and again, it's another choice that a customer has to make, there's a mandatory opt-in that they have to go through, which includes a tutorial. It's a mandatory tutorial that they have to review before they go through the results. And at both of these steps, we make clear and provide information about what they can learn from their report, and also the limitations of the report. You know, the benefit of a screening tool like 23andMe is identifying risks for people who aren't otherwise going to qualify for clinical testing in our current healthcare system. And published research shows that as many as 50% of BRCA1 and BRCA2 carriers would not qualify for clinical testing. So our research additionally shows that a large number of the BRCA carriers in the 23andMe database for those select variants that we report on do not report that they have Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, or they don't report that they have a first-degree family member with a history of cancer. So these individuals, in working with their doctors, would not otherwise have one of the sequencing tests that Robert mentions ordered for them because they don't meet the clinical standard for such an order.
So Erin and Fatimah, though, in practice, do you think people are using these tests as a substitute for healthcare? Like, you know what, I don't have any insurance. Let me get this test. I don't have these 3 SNPs. I'm good. I'm never going to get breast cancer. Like, you know, in practice, how do you think consumers are using this information?
In my experience, the tests are pretty much useless because they're not looking at the allelic markers that are most relevant given my ancestral population. So even something as benign as lactose malabsorption or lactose excessive production of lactase beyond the weaning stage, the alleles that are reported are not the alleles that are commonly encountered in many African descended populations. So the information, we almost take it as a joke. And because of the heterogeneity, the high levels of heterogeneity that we see in many African diasporic populations, I've been told by these DTC companies that you definitely have straight hair. And it's like, no, that's not right. You definitely have light skin. And no, that's not right. So sometimes their statements, their downstream ramifications are more of a joke. What I'm hoping is that it gets back to the reference database. We have to have a comprehensive reference database for comparative purposes. Otherwise, people of color in particular will be left out of the whole precision medicine revolution. It will be a revolution for only North Atlantic European populations and their descendants. And that's not fair because we're all in this together.
And Fatimah, if I can just build on that, I agree with everything you've said, but I would frame parts of it differently in the sense that when people are told they have curly hair and they don't, or they're told they, you know, can curl their tongue or they don't, this is actually a useful lesson in the non-determinism of genomics.
Mm-hmm.
People walked into the genomics world thinking that it was a crystal ball, that it gave them perfect prediction of the future, because the very first few diseases we discovered were like that, but they turned out to be the exception. The rule is actually that all genomic information, virtually all genomic information, ancestry, disease, is probabilistic. Now that can be really valuable because if you learn you're in a different risk stratification for a condition like cancer or heart disease, you may be able to pick it up early and stop it. But we've really had to break the hold of that deterministic narrative. And ironically, Fatimah, I think that these little errors or these probabilistic calls in what we call recreational genomics has actually helped with that. I think it's taught people some of the limitations of genomics.
If I could add to that, you know, I just had a couple of things. One is I think it's absolutely imperative that people do understand, as some of the last comments have drawn out, there's differences among genetic tests. People think genetic tests, it's like all the same thing. Whole genome sequencing versus SNPs versus another form called SDRs that's talked about in the program. These are very different tests with very different powers and very different privacy implications and so on. Understanding that's key. It's also critical to understand that different DTC companies are different. They're different in their commitment to privacy. They're different in the validity of what they are offering in terms of backing up with science, what they claim they can do. They're different in the quality of the laboratories, whether they're certified or not certified under clinical standards, et cetera. And I think a lot of consumers are not aware of any of this. They think of, you know, the way that if I go to a doctor and I get a strep test, you can replicate that trust at any doctor's office, and by and large, outside of a grossly incompetent physician, I'm going to get the same result. And that's just not true on every level when it comes to DNA. I also would say that, I worry that COVID has taught us people are really bad at probabilities and risk probabilities and understanding. If we have learned nothing this past year, we have learned that people do not actually understand risk exposure and so forth. And so it's concerning to me, and in a context where there isn't a healthcare right, there isn't an opportunity to either in advance have a physician consult with you and ask the kind of questions Fatimah would ask. What is your ancestral background and so forth? Or even if you, get the test and the test, comes back positive or what have you, you don't even have a right on the back end to the healthcare that you would need to contextualize that. You heard in the film, someone got retested by a clinical physician. They were able to consult with doctors who advise them the next course of action. And I do worry that someone gets a test like that and they decide, the best thing they should do is something rather dramatic health-wise without that kind of advice or competent care. And so putting this in the context of available healthcare is also, I think, critical to understanding the leveling effects.
And Erin, that's exactly right. And that's why we co-founded Genome Medical, because it's a telemedicine genetics medical practice in all 50 states. And we're covering 100 million lives with insurance now. And you can get an appointment in a very short time with a very low cost and get certified testing for anything you might have found in your DTC testing or anything you might not have found in your DTC testing. And that's because we believe that ultimately the health benefits will come when this information is integrated with the rest of your health care. Now, doctors are really slow to pick up new things. We're like so behind. We're barely using email. But, and DTC deserves all this credit for democratizing, for blowing open the hegemony of, medical geneticists who didn't want to play outside their sandbox. But what the future has got to look like is get rid of this genetics exceptionalism, integrate genetics into everyday medical practice, and use it as the tip of the spear to change all of medicine from reactive to proactive, from treating people after they get disease to predicting conditions and preventing them. That's one of the things I think that this whole decade is going to get remembered for.
I agree with what Robert has said. That's very true. And I would say that in order to get to where you'd like us to be, we have to have as sophisticated an understanding of the environment as we have of the genome. Right now, if there's not a balance, and the environment as a causal entity in shaping the phenotype is kind of like a black box, and so we need quantitative assessments of what's going on in individuals and communities' environments that influence gene expression patterns, so that we can make solid predictions, robust predictions about health. So I am agreeing with you and augmenting it. No, I agree with you, and I raise you 300.
I just wanted to follow up on your point on reports for African communities of color, and wholeheartedly agree. We have still so much work to do to improve our understanding, both in the genetic context, but also in the environmental context. And 23andMe continues to work on this. I just wanted to highlight, one of our reports more recently released, TTR, hereditary amyloidosis. Did I say that right, Robert?
Amyloidosis, yeah.
Is a test that is studied in and relevant to African populations. It's something that we are proud to have recently released, and we continue to do research in this area to try to improve representation across our product. Going back to the question you had, Talithia, on do consumers understand what they're getting? I point out for 23andMe, the reports that we deliver to consumers and their experience through the steps in order to receive those reports have gone through FDA review, and they meet FDA standards for user comprehension. And what that means is that we had to show that over 90% of participants in the user study understood the genetic concepts that we were communicating in the reports, and that they understood what a result meant. So for example, if somebody got the 0 variant result, they understood that it meant that we were not testing for all variants that were associated with that condition, that there were thousands of variants related to that condition that we don't test for, and that they still need to undergo clinical screening.
Thanks, panelists. We're going to move on to our last clip so we can save time for questions. So Alondra Nelson says, you're actually paying your money to give your data to another company, and then it's going to be capitalized on potentially without benefit to you. I'm curious, panelists, how is the test taker data protected? And if consent is given, how is that data then used?
So I'll kick off there. So 23andMe, our principles around data are transparency, consent, and security. So fundamentally at the core, you can't have privacy without security. We're constantly testing our system, and we make sure that our systems and how we store data assures a consumer that their data is secure with us. I wanted to address Dr. Nelson's specific point about this notion that you're paying for data and then it's capitalized on, because fundamental and in order for us to be able to use data and analyze your data and research, you have to opt in separately to participate in our research program. In that research program, indeed, about 80% of our customers participate, and we believe that's because individuals, we all know somebody who has suffered from a condition, and if they can contribute to be able to lead to a scientific discovery that helps lead to a drug or therapeutic that can meet that medical need, there's a willingness to do so. Our research program also, I think it's important to note, is governed by a third-party independent ethics review board, an IRB. And the IRB reviews our consents, reviews our protocol, and how we're using data in our research program to make sure it meets ethical and legal standards. One of those is to make sure consent is informed. So, I don't believe that customers and research participants don't understand what it is that they're participating in. I do believe our customers understand it, and they want to participate to make this contribution to accelerate scientific discoveries to better humankind.
I think we also saw in the film where, genetic genealogy was being used to make arrests, sometimes for crimes that were over 30 years old. And Erin, you brought up this point earlier. If folks do a consumer test, is their information automatically included in some database somewhere? Or is it sort of, as you say, Jacquie, you have to opt in order for it to even be visible to anyone else?
Yeah, so it's 23andMe, no third party has access to our database, and we don't share that information with any third party without your consent. We do not share information with law enforcement. We were the first company to publish a transparency report in 2015, and this provides information on the number of requests from law enforcement that we receive and the number of times we've provided any individual user data. As we noted in my numbers, that number continues to be 0. We do believe customers should control their data and own their data. So we do enable individuals to be able to download their genetic data file. And in certain cases, individuals choose to make that download and upload it to a public database. Those are typically the databases that are in the middle of the law enforcement genealogy work that we hear about a lot.
So I would just add on to that a few things. I mean, again, I think it's important to understand not every DTC company is the same. And I'm sure Jacquie will be happy to hear that of them, I think 23andMe, in my vantage point, has been the most serious in its commitment to the privacy values it espouses. Unfortunately, I think other things are true that every consumer has to keep in mind. First, 23andMe has had to go to court to fight law enforcement efforts. So it says a lot about their commitment that they do that. And it says a lot about their lawyers that they win. But it's, not a given that law enforcement can't get this information. And in fact, a judge has granted a subpoena in a different circumstance. But I think most lawyers will tell you this is an open legal question. What exactly is required for subpoena access or other kinds of warrant access to the data? Secondly, ultimately, these are private companies and this is their asset. Your genetic information is your asset. And that's where I think Alondra is absolutely correct, that you have to be mindful that that's what you're dealing with in many ways. So we see that BlackRock bought Ancestry for $4.7 billion. And that's not because they sell great ads on Ancestry's website. They think the data that they're acquiring is worth $4.7 billion. Again, that's not because a $100 DTC test is worth $4.7 billion. It's because the genetic information they hold is worth $4.7 billion. So I think that's important to remember. GEDmatch, the public open source database that Jacquie was referring to earlier, has sort of been acquired by or integrated with Verogen, which is a law enforcement targeted company. FamilyTreeDNA, a private company, signed on to a privacy policy that 23andMe, I believe, spearheaded. They got together all the DTC companies to say, let's be deeply committed to privacy. Let's not share information with law enforcement. Let's try to build the reputation of our industry. FamilyTreeDNA signed on to that. And then a year later, an investigative reporter uncovered that they had been cooperating with the FBI without informing their clients. Literally 2 days after the story broke in the New York Times, you could still go to their website and the front of the page would say, we are deeply committed to your privacy. We will never share, sell, or otherwise disclose information. If law enforcement demands information, we will disclose to you that we've shared it. And, the consequences of breaking those rules are unclear. It's not at all, Family Tree has not gone under. As you can see, it's still thriving. And, GEDmatch was acquired. So I think that's important. Secondly, companies have very different commitments to security and whether they operate closed systems or open systems. So 23andMe, I think properly tells you own your data so you can download it. But when you go into its ecosystem, you're in its ecosystem. I can't just kind of go traipsing around the 23andMe database as just an ordinary person. But other companies, that's not the case. They have a kind of more open-facing or outward-facing ecosystem. Companies have different commitments to the security of their data. I think GEDmatch, I just heard, is on its second data breach right now, which included the reactivation of deleted profiles. So people have thought, I'm off, I'm out, especially maybe law enforcement's going to be walking around in there, I'm out. And now, lo and behold, they have a data breach which reactivates those profiles and has them, exposed. So last, I'll just say, I always tell people, DNA is enduring, it is unalterable, and it's in its infancy. It is enduring, which means it goes backward in time and it goes forward in time. Whatever DNA means, it will mean the same thing for your great, 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 great grandchildren that it means right now in this moment. It's also unalterable. Unlike a credit card that gets co-opted or a cell phone number that you're sick of, you can't ask to be reissued your DNA. I mean, I know CRISPR, et cetera, but as far as we know right now, you're stuck with your DNA, your ancestors are stuck with their DNA, and your descendants will be stuck with your DNA, whether or not it was wise in 2020 to have shared that information and there were adequate protections of it when you did. And lastly, it's in its infancy. And again, we're doing lots of research right now to figure out what it can tell us. And it absolutely is of consequence, some of the things it can tell us, both genetic things it tells us, like propensities to certain diseases or dispositions, but also non-genetic things. If you link 100 people who have no real world association and you go looking through birth records, death records, marriage records, employment records, housing records, you don't need a genetic test to figure out the men in this family die young, heart attacks. You don't need a genetic test to figure out these are a bunch of Catholics. You don't need a genetic test to determine, these people tend to not really go to college. They don't have high educational attainment, or they don't have a stable work environment, or they tend to seem to fall into drugs, or there are fertility issues in this family. Those are all things that genetics can tell you without a genetic test. And I think we have to be mindful of that.
That's the time that we have on this section. I want to go to the questions that have come up in our chat so we can give the audience a chance to weigh in. Jacquie, I'll send this first question your way. What laws currently prevent insurance companies from using DNA test results to calculate insurance premiums?
So federally, there is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that prohibits health insurance companies from being able to use your genetic information in decision making. There's also across the United States a number of states that prohibit life insurance and long-term care insurance from doing the same. Most recently, last year, there was a law passed in Florida. I think following on Erin's comment previously, and again, to reiterate, I think there is a significant role for policymakers to play here in making sure that all players in this industry, that all genetic testing companies are held to the same high standards around privacy and security, and that we otherwise, as a society through policy, come together and say, how is it that we want to allow the state, or we want to allow insurance companies to be able to use any genetic information so that we can really support individuals in being able to access their genetics without concerns around privacy or security.
Thanks, Jacquie. Next question is going to go to you, Robert, and if you can answer succinctly, that would be great. Would an alternate model for a private direct-to-consumer ever include transparency and giving back to those communities?
Oh, I think so. I think that I agreed with everything Erin said in her impassioned statement, but I actually think that that sensibility has actually obstructed a lot of progress in genomics, because the actual examples of privacy breaches, of insurance discrimination, have been vanishingly small. And the problem is that fear of privacy, fear of insurance discrimination has done tremendous damage to the appropriate medical uptake of genetics. And that's really important. We need to account for ethics. We need to account for privacy without somehow stopping innovation. The other thing I wanted to mention, just to contextualize, is of course, your data is part of the asset that direct-to-consumer companies can then sell to pharma. But this is not really different than what academic centers have been doing. We all try to tell our research participants that their data may be used for innovations that then make money for the institution, make patents, all that sort of thing. We've been doing that for decades in healthcare institutions, academic centers. So, you know, it's not necessary to sort of put them under the microscope all by themselves. But if you did want to share the wealth, there are actually examples. There's something, Luna DNA, for example, is a company out there that's been trying to organize people to contribute their genomics to research and give them back something in return that can give them financial assets and returns if their particular DNA is used, like say to make a breakthrough discovery. So lots going on in the conversation about privacy. Let's not let it overshadow the possible benefits to humanity.
Yes.
And
Fatimah, I'm coming. Let me go to Fatimah with the next question. I just want to try to get through as many as possible. Someone wants to know, how do we characterize diversity? You mentioned that, but what kind of criteria would you use to sort of characterize?
Well, I think that diversity is a moving target. That what we consider to be diversity 50 years ago is not the same as what we consider diversity today. I was thinking back, and I'm a little concerned about the comment that Alondra Nelson made, because we as communities of color and communities that have been disenfranchised historically really need to have a serious discussion about, do we want to be included in precision medicine? And if we do, what are we willing to contribute towards that? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't, say, well, you can't have my DNA because you didn't pay me. And then say, why don't you have any drugs for me? When I don't have the capability to produce my own drugs for my particular DNA variants. So there has to be some maturation, I would say, in the perspective of communities. Yes, there's been abuses in the past. Yes, the diversity among us has been abused. But can we form some new relationships, kind of along the lines that Robert was speaking of? Because we need each other, we need each other. We can't make genes. We need the genetic diversity that exists among us, and we need to be aware of it and to capitalize on it. And whether that means that I make $1 million because I've got a unique variant is really irrelevant. I think we need to go beyond this. You need to pay me if you want some of this nonsense, and form the collaborations with the powers that be that have the expertise to do the research that will help our communities. Now, I'm sorry.
You're fine. I just want to get to as many questions as possible because our time is almost up. This may be our last question. Someone asked, can you speak to the social and economic inequity that may additionally contribute to the lack of DNA or genetic information for the Asian and African or Black communities? Subscriptions and testing cost money and are not a priority for many people. Robert, I know your company like directly sort of provides things. Do you want to maybe comment on that?
Yeah, I think this was, I mean, in retrospect, this was a wrong direction that the science took, but it certainly wasn't meant that way. I mean, what happened was people collected DNA samples, first 1,000, then 5,000, then 20,000, then 100,000, and excitedly did analyses on them and discovered things, and kind of dawned on us that, gosh, they were all coming from one ancestry group. And then the United Kingdom invested more in genomics than anybody in the world and created the UK Biobank with 500,000 people whose genomes are being freely distributed. Now, what's often lost is that there are still 40 or 50 or 80,000 people who are not of European ancestry. So it's not like they ignored it, but it's undeniable. Just going back to what Fatimah said earlier, it's undeniable that both the ancestry, but more importantly for the health, we can't do as good a job of looking for pathogenic variants in someone who is not of European ancestry, because we simply don't have the large databases and the understanding of the variation. So that needs to be fixed. And awareness of the historical problems, but motivation by groups that have been left out, as Fatimah suggested, I think is a wonderful place to meet in the middle.
Yes.
Yes. Erin, I want to close on this last question for you before I ask you all to share your one-word story. According to LA Times, police misled the public over what DNA databases were used to catch the Golden State Killer. It wasn't just GEDmatch, but Heritage DNA that provided the hit in the case. Can you give us your reaction to that? And what does it tell us about law enforcement's use of genetic genealogy? You commented on this a little bit, but if you can share.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember the press conference and I was on a text chain with friends who are interested, legal scholars who are interested in this that are friends. And we were all like, it's a DTC database. It must be a DTC, because they wouldn't say. It took them a few days and then finally a reporter outed it. I'll say that, I am sympathetic to the views that have been expressed about the promise in the medical context of this information, the need to diversify those data banks, the need not to have this, apartheid system of precision medicine. We can have it both ways. There's a lot of communities in this country that will have it both ways. They'll be protected from law enforcement scrutiny and they will have access to precision medicine. What I want is for us to have the legal regimes in place that ensure that protection for everyone, that your decision to have a precision medicine experience isn't compromising the safety of your relatives, the security of your relatives. And so I think we should have a world, or your own future, your health insurance and life insurance and all these other things, which legally is a little bit more patchwork than people like to make out. So I think you can have it both ways. I think we should demand those things. Maryland, I just make a plug that the state of Maryland they've just introduced a bill, Senator Sidner in Maryland, to regulate genetic genealogy. I think if it's something that a state's interested in doing, the bill is a beautiful template for how to do it responsibly. And I hope other states will copy that so that people can feel more secure about sharing information that's critical for health without sacrificing other critical human values as well.
Thank you so much, Erin. And in fact, why don't you start us off? As part of the Computer History Museum's One Word Initiative, you all were asked to write down one word of advice for a young person who's starting out their career. So can each of you share what your one word is and the story behind why you chose it? Erin, why don't you start us off?
So I chose authenticity. I don't actually mean authenticity in your presentation to others. I mean authenticity in yourself, which is to say a career is a long thing and it's something that you're going to hopefully enjoy doing. And if you're authentic and true to what moves you and what makes you excited, then I think that you'll find that the promise of your career comes naturally. It's only when you're kind of forcing yourself, I think, or faking it, that it often is the case that you end up hitting roadblocks because you kind of yourself don't want to be where you are.
Yes, great. Jacquie, can you share your word with us?
Let's make sure I can hold that up there. So my word is dig deep. So as a once competitive long distance runner, and I'm still trying, gets harder every day. I'll always carry with me the encouragement the coaches give you around digging deep. And, you know, as a youth, that sometimes felt more like an admonishment than encouragement. But, you know, what's meant by this is to dig deep within your stores and your capacities and realize on depths that you didn't appreciate you had. And professionally, I still find this incredibly useful in two ways. First, it's to dig deep into the details. Knowing the details really matters. It matters when you're in a role like mine as an advisor and an advocate, but I think whatever your role, it goes to knowing the why behind why you're pushing forward on a position or idea. And the second reason goes back to those coaches, to dig deep in your stores, into your heart and your passion and what motivates you, and really give it your all every single day.
Fantastic, I love it. Fatimah, what is your word?
My word is resilience.
Oh, we can't see that.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, there.
Yeah, hold it in front of yourself, maybe.
There we go.
Perfect.
I guess it's backwards. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so resilience. And it kind of goes along with Jackie's digging deep. If you're alive, if you're a human, you're going to face obstacles. And the obstacles are a part of life. But a lot of times, the things that we consider as setbacks, in the long run, when we have that broadened perspective, we realize that these were actually opportunities. And it's resilience that I'm particularly interested in, because I feel that if we have a superficial view of history, none of us should be alive now. But there's something about our existence, there's something about our struggle that allows us to overcome and excel in spite of the limitations. And so resilience for me is something worth striving for, because we all need it.
Yes, fantastic. And Robert, why don't you close us out?
Okay, my word is focus. And I mean this in two ways. I mean it to younger individuals, because it's so tempting to spread yourself, even trying to spread yourself between being a clinician and being a researcher, which is what most residents and fellows sort of start off thinking they're going to do. It's really hard to do both well. So I'm constantly telling people to say no to things and to really, really focus on the things that are important and the things that they want to do with all the words that you guys did. And for myself, even at this stage in my career, it's hard because in a soft money environment, you're constantly looking for sources of funding and can I get this NIH grant? And that's focused over there on this one. But I've really decided to focus in the next few years on what it means to try to sequence healthy individuals, particularly healthy newborn babies, in what we call our Baby Seek project. And we're going to really focus on that to see if we can start to transform medicine from this reactive state to a proactive state by dispelling the fears that everybody has of privacy breaches and discrimination, and emphasizing the genuine benefits and cost effectiveness of learning about genetic risk stratification early. So that's what I'm going to focus on, and I hope I encourage all of my trainees to find their passion and really focus on that.
Well, panelists, thank you so much for your time this evening. If attendees, you can give sort of a virtual hand clap or a thumbs up in the chat to thank our panelists. And as we close, Daniel, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Talithia. I want to thank our partners at NOVA and Chris Schmidt in particular. This is a world-class program as far as I'm concerned. This is right up the alley of where Computer History Museum is going. Life as we know it doesn't exist without computing. And those people who are part of the world that is focused on the opportunity that computing can bring to our lives every day, are thinking about health in particular. Education and energy, of course, at the top of the list as well. I want to thank everyone for what you did today. If you enjoyed the program and you have the wherewithal, please go to our website and consider joining the museum and giving. We are struggling like most cultural institutions. We'll definitely be a survivor, but your support will help us go a long way for programs like this. So once again, I'd like to thank the panelists, Talithia, Robert, Jacquie, Erin, and Fatimah. Thanks so much, and we appreciate your support. Bye for now.